Hello and welcome everyone to the DoD EDIS Early Intervention Services webinar series. My name is Jane Dooley and I'm the technical host. And before I turn it over to our presenter, Dr. Naomi Youngren, I just have a few brief housekeeping items to review with everyone real quick. In addition to viewing the presentation there from your computer, a copy of the slide deck was emailed out to registrants earlier, probably about 40 minutes ago or so. At the time, I had about 86 registrants. So I'm going to go back and take a look after we get started here and check the list. And if we've got more names on there, I will go ahead and resend it out in case there's folks that may have registered at the very last minute here and did not receive a copy. If you're just listening by phone and did not happen to receive the slide deck through the registration system, if you want to send an email to myself, I'll go ahead and get a copy of it sent out to you. And you can email me at MOSwebinars, that's for Military OneSource, MOSwebinars@militaryOneSource.mil. And I will go ahead and email a copy to you once I turn this over to Naomi. We're going to be presenting the material over the next 60 to 90 minutes or so, and then we're going to follow that up with question and answer periods. And as you all know, Dr. Youngren is also going to stop periodically to take questions as well as to conduct polls. And in order to enhance the accessibility for both the live and the archived events for both the hearing and the visually impaired users, we're going to be making a conscious effort to kind of verbally review much of the content that you see on the slides today, and that is a 508 compliance piece. So before the last little piece I have is to read this quick disclaimer, just so folks are aware that the appearance of hyperlinks does not constitute endorsement by the Department of Defense of this website or the information, products, or services contained therein. For other than authorized activities such as military exchanges and morale, welfare, and recreation sites, the Department of Defense does not exercise any editorial control over the information that you may find at these locations. Such links are provided consistent with the stated purpose of this DoD-sponsored webinar. So that is what I have in terms of housekeeping. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over then to our presenter, Dr. Naomi Youngren. Naomi?
Yep, I'm here. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm going to flip through the slides Jane just went through. Today we're going to continue our examination of the process and specifically the continuation of IFSP development, looking at our EDIS tri-service IFSP process. As you all know, this is where we're at in the process now at IFSP, which is certainly going to be guiding our ongoing service delivery when we get to this point. Last time we also talked about outcomes measurement, which was the measurement of child and family outcomes regarding the national initiative. We are in the 6th of our 7-part webinar series. So the next one, just as a reminder, and we'll give you this heads up at the end as well, next week we do not have a webinar, partly because of the holiday that's there and to give ourselves a little bit of a break. So our final webinar in the 7-part series is going to be the 28th and the 30th of January, so that last week of January, just as a reminder so that you can put that on your calendars. There was a registration flyer that should have gone out, so you all should have the opportunity to register for that 7th webinar at this point in time. So let's move on to the objectives. Our objectives for today are to specifically look at developing IFSP outcomes and measurable criteria from the family's identified priorities, like we talked about when we discussed the RBI. We'll examine some quality markers for child and family outcomes and criteria. And as part of IFSP outcomes and measurable criteria, we're also going to look at the requirements for procedures and timelines for measuring IFSP outcomes. All of these are required components, IDEA required components in the IFSP. Then we're going to spend some time discussing strategies and where they go. I'm also thrilled to have a couple of colleagues join me to discuss strategies and some further documentation of strategies. So the only form that's needed for today's webinar is the IFSP and, of course, the IFSP Process Guidance Handbook. We're going to be covering pages 53 through 66 of the handbook, so please feel free to follow along. So let's get started. Here, what you see on the screen now is our focus is going to be on Section 9 of the IFSP. This is the Outcomes page. What you see on the page now is the top half of the page. You'll notice on your actual copy, which if you don't have a copy, you can download that from the file share, the top and the bottom section of the page are the exact same. This means that there's room for 2 outcomes on each physical page, unless, of course, you're doing it front to back, then you'd have 2 on each side, so 4 total. On each outcome section, there's room for the written outcome, and you'll see that here. There's room for the criteria. You'll see that here. And there's room for procedures and timelines. And then there's also a section at the bottom of each outcome where there is an opportunity to review, and up to 5 reviews. There's space for up to 5 reviews. So we're going to talk about each one of these components. I also want to highlight to you, you'll notice here in the gray after outcome, there are some little prompters. So what would you like to see happen when, where, or with whom and why? So it's just some prompters to help remind what are some components that we want to see included in the outcome, in the criteria, in the procedures, as well as in the timeline. So just a couple reminder prompts there that are included in the IFSP. So as we move along, we're going to look to some good advice from Pooh Bear. And he says, before beginning a long journey, it is wise to know where you are going. That way you will know that you've arrived once you get there. In many ways, this is the IFSP, which of course shifts and adjusts as needed depending upon family circumstances. The IFSP does mark a starting point of where you and the team, the family, are, and identifies what the team plans to do together. It can be thought of almost like a roadmap. And certainly I imagine you all know the difference between a really good roadmap and one that is not so good, or perhaps one that is out of date. The completed IFSP-PD provides really that roadmap for early intervention services. And the elements that are included in the IFSP build upon each other, as we've been talking about in our webinar series. And when completed, the IFSP is really going to facilitate a process that acknowledges the family within the context of the family, that acknowledges the child within the context of the family, and the inclusion of all required components. Certainly there are regulatory components to be in accord with IDEA that we have to have included in the IFSP. We also want to make sure that it must reflect the family's desires and their interests, and it must be written clearly so that all team members can understand it and can implement it. So let's get us started with a poll. I'm thinking about good quality IFSP outcomes to help the team guide the ongoing intervention services. Take a minute here to identify which of the following examples are functional quality IFSP outcomes. I do want to note that the criteria is not included in these examples. Okay, excellent. You are absolutely correct. It is A and C. I don't see anybody marking B or D as identified quality IFSP. They do not include the functional context. They're more isolated individual skills or are broad and nebulous. So really it's A and C, which you all have identified. Excellent. Any questions or comments on any of these examples before we move on? Okay, I'm going to move on, and I know some of this might be a little bit of a review, but EI, as you all know, has evolved over the years, and we certainly learned a lot over the years as a result of advances in research and policy and advances in practice as well. So where do IFSP outcomes come from? What you see here on the screen is an illustration of the old way that it used to be done and the new way. What we want is we want to use the current quality roadmap, that is IFSP, that has functional outcomes that are gleaned from authentic assessment and routine-based interviews rather than just deficit-based domains from missed assessment items. We want outcomes that are based on family priorities with input certainly from providers and the expertise that you share with families. Families in early intervention are going to choose what they want to work on, and providers, of course, are going to share information and ask questions to ensure that the priority is understood and clearly stated. I don't know if any of you remember when we used to ask, so what do you want to work on? And that would oftentimes result in some fairly broad or nebulous outcomes such as, well, I want them to be doing what other kids his age are doing. And at one point in time in the evolution of early intervention practices, we would write, family wants him, so-and-so to be doing what other kids his age are doing. What we know now is that that type of outcome is much too broad and much too nebulous to know really what it is that we're working on. So we want to ensure that we've got functional IFSP outcomes based on functional skills and behaviors that are needed in routines and activities. The outcomes should reinforce children's participation in routines and activities and not just focus on what the child will not do. We want to also be thinking about replacement behaviors and not just extinguishing undesirable behaviors. We also want to make sure that outcomes have a parent-child focus and not just be child-centered alone. In early intervention, as you well know, the plan can include what the family wants to have happen for their family or for other families and not just the child who is eligible for early intervention services. I think it's helpful to look at this particular little table of the old way and the new way, and not to say that the old way was wrong, but really to think about it in terms of as early intervention has evolved and changed and grown and learned so much from advances that we can look to now the new way and how it is that we really want to ensure that IFSP outcomes are truly functional and truly based on family priorities. Essentially, when we think about IFSP outcomes, there are two types of IFSP outcomes, those that are specific to the child and those that are related to family needs or other family members. Child outcomes are related to the functional skills or abilities of the child, such as social interaction, engagement and learning, mastery over the environment, increased independence, a variety of different things. For example, learning to interact and play with his sister, being able to entertain himself by playing with toys for a longer period of time while parents are able to make dinner, to sleep through the night, are different types of child outcomes. Of course, the child outcomes are going to be unique to the individual child and the family's priorities. Family outcomes are related to family needs, with intervention focused on the family rather than primarily on the child. The family outcomes may be child-related, such as getting information about the child's diagnoses, learning ways to do something with or for the child. Family outcomes could also, however, be for the family or other family members. Maybe it's learning about ways to keep in touch with a deployed spouse or finding resources for childcare for siblings. So when we think about IFSP outcomes, we have to remember there are child-level outcomes and there are family-level outcomes. Interestingly, as research has occurred and looked at IFSP outcomes in the past, what has been found is there have been fewer family outcomes on IFSPs. It's not to say that there is any set percentage of child outcomes and family outcomes, but what we really want to do is make sure that we keep in the forefront that family outcomes are certainly part of the IFSP and can be included, assuming that the family chooses to have that on their IFSP. I'm going to move on now to a resource that is in your IFSP handbook. This is just a glimpse at the IFSP rubric. You will find the entire rubric located in Appendix A of your IFSP process guidance handbook. This here is just an excerpt of the rubric that looks specifically at child-level outcomes. So with regards to functional child-level outcomes, some things that we're going to be looking for is you'll see here on the rubric, those things that are unacceptable. These are the things that we don't want. We don't want outcomes that are too broad or too vague. We don't want outcomes that are not developmentally appropriate or not realistic. We don't want outcomes that have little or no relationship to present levels of development or family concerns. And we don't want outcomes that talk about, the child will tolerate, or just outcomes that talk about he will no longer do X, Y, Z. We really want to be thinking functional and what is the replacement behavior. So in this first column, what you see are those things that we don't want. And then what we see as we move along this continuum, and it's a 4-point scale with anchored statements at 0, 2, and 4. The things that we do want to see in child-level outcomes is we want to see that it's written in family-friendly language. It should be linked to the family's desire That is, what was their priority from the routine-based interview? It has to be linked to family priorities. And then what we want to see is we want to see it answer these questions. It should be clearly stated what we want to see happen, when, where, with whom, and what's going to be better. In looking at the rubric, this next level is best practice. Ultimately, this is where we want to go, but we recognize that there's a continuum here. In best practice, we'd have all of the items from response item 2, that would be this column. We also want to make sure that the outcomes are specific and functional. We want to make sure that they clearly contain one outcome. Later on, we'll talk a little bit about compound outcomes. We want our outcomes to be very specific. We don't want compound outcomes, something like if we had an outcome that, Christine will participate in bedtime by pointing to pictures in the book and going to bed after book time. That's really a compound outcome. One is about pointing to pictures in the book, and the other is about going to bed or sleeping in her bed. So that's an example of a compound kind of outcome. So we want to make sure that our outcomes are clear and singular. And then here we've got the questions that we want to have included in the outcome. Another little aside or caution when you're thinking about writing outcomes is you want them to be participatory. You don't want them to be passive. So words such as tolerate, receive, increase or decrease, improve or maintain are words that we probably want to avoid because they're not congruent with functional, meaningful outcome statements. So those are best avoided. Another critical component with regards to IFSP outcomes and child-level outcomes, and that we're reminded here as well, is that it is of utmost importance to think about context. We need to gather information about family routines to understand the situation and what needs to happen to improve those challenging times for families and ultimately to enhance children's learning opportunities. And we're reminded here that interventions with children fail to be implemented and sustained when they do not fit the daily routine or when the intervention is not compatible with the goals and values and beliefs of the parent. So we have to make sure that the goals that are included in the IFSP are truly the priorities that the family has set. Let's move on to a poll question. Again, this is about outcomes. Take a look at the list here. Again, I will remind you that the criteria are not included in these particular outcomes. Considering context and the importance of context, identify the outcomes here that include context. All right. Jane, I'm just going to do a quick sound check. Can you still hear me?
I can, thank you.
Okay. I had another call, and I wanted to make sure that didn't boot me off.
Very good.
Okay, excellent. Excellent responses here as well. It is, in fact, A, B, and D, which is what you all have identified. From the list here, we can see that item C is an example here of that improve. To improve her communication skills doesn't tell us the context of when that will be used. And then here is another, E is an example of a very broad outcome, age-appropriate social skills. It's really difficult to know exactly what it is that is. All right, so moving along, and to highlight the importance here is to be specific. So let me read the cartoon that's included here for you. It says, don't you think this goal is a bit vague? Mark will improve communication skills. And the response is, no, that way it can mean whatever you want it to, and we'll never have to change the IEP, or in this case, IFSP. I've used that goal for Mark for the last 5 years. So clearly, I think this is a bit of an exaggeration, obviously. But what we do want to make sure to ensure that we've got good quality functional IFSP outcomes is that they have to be specific. They can't be broad. They can't be nebulous. We want to know exactly what it is that we're working towards, and everybody on the team needs to be able to understand the outcomes, and the outcomes have to be written in such a way that we can truly see what it is that we're working towards. Included here and also included in the IFSP Guidance Handbook are some examples, and these are just examples of some family priorities. These are things that families have, some examples that families have chosen of priorities, and it also includes here in the table what's happening now. It's important that the team members fully understand what the family's priority and what is happening now. If we don't know this information as we're leaving, as we're finishing up the RBI, then it's going to be really hard to generate or to write these into IFSP outcomes. So I certainly can't impress upon enough is to make sure that as you're finishing up the routine-based interview and identifying what the family's priorities are, that everybody on the team there has a good, clear understanding of what that is. It is possible to generate this information at the RBI and then go back to the office and write these priorities as outcomes. Doing so is not excluding the family. Rather, what it is that you're doing is you're taking their information that they've identified and you're going to write it into outcome format and then review that with them at a later date. It is, however, also possible to do this during the visit with the family. So you've got some options here. Let me move on to a resource that has been helpful. This is the first part of the resource. It's the Child Outcome Algorithm. It is developed by Robin McWilliams. This is the start of it for the outcome, and then we're going to review in just a few slides the rest of it, which is the criteria. This algorithm, does illustrate the preferred approach to writing child-level outcomes. While it is not required for writing each child-level outcome, it can be helpful and, as I said, is strongly recommended as a tool. It helps to ensure that each outcome has the required components. Another little key thing with it is that in using this particular algorithm, it can be helpful for families because it produces a bit of a predictable pattern that can be easier for families to understand and follow. At this point, I would like to turn it over to a colleague of mine, Suzanne Taylor from Fort Campbell, to speak a little bit about the algorithm and how they've used it. Suzanne, are you on the line?
I am. Naomi had asked me just to speak a little bit to kind of how we use the algorithm as well as how we got to using the algorithm. And so I can say we truly did write at one point in our program, wrote outcomes based on, Johnny will use 25 words throughout the day, those kind of things, which at the time seemed like the thing to do. But as we have progressed as a program, we realized that really we kind of made our own outcomes and sometimes alienated families and didn't show them that the functionality was needed for those things. So it's great that he has 25 words, but is he using them functionally? Is it helping the family to have a better day and to enjoy their time together where he's not so frustrated? So we started using the algorithm when we had some training with Dr. McWilliam and with Naomi as well. And at that point, kind of just made it a blanket thing that all outcomes on plans needed to look like this. Because when we deviated away from that, we realized that we would lose the context. And so when you write them in that format the child will participate in, you're assuring that you're going to get a routine or the context, which is also helpful for the family because we still have families that will say, I just want them to talk. And so at least then we're drilling down to what is the time of the day that is really difficult for that family that they really would like for that child to be able to use words or to do whatever that is difficult for them or developmentally what they're wanting their child to work on. And so we realized that that helped us. And then knowing by doing what do they expect? And then so we understand, well, how is this going to make life a little bit easier for you, or that you feel like that this child is on their way developmentally. As a program here, it helps us to be very consistent. At first, it was very difficult because we felt like we were not being individualized with families, but we realized that really we were kind of making it easier because we weren't writing outcomes all over the place in all different ways, and that each provider was being very consistent and trying to write the same way so that no matter if two people were getting together to write outcomes or just one person was helping with that family, then that way we were consistent across the board. And if someone happened to pick up a plan or look at a plan, it was very consistent that those elements were there. Also, it helped us to narrow down
what the family kind of wanted and be able to understand why they were wanting things, which came from the RBI, but also helped us to drill down, as Naomi's going to talk about later, the criteria to know why they wanted these things and how we were going to try to get there as a team as well. And so I would say from our perspective here, we're a little larger program. It helps us with consistency. I think it's very parent-friendly, and it keeps us honest on making sure we have the context and also knowing why and how we're going to get to the outcome within the algorithm. Anything else, Naomi?
No, thank you very much for sharing that. I understand, as I've had the opportunity to talk with Suzanne, I asked her to speak a little bit more about that because I know that they had really worked hard to move towards more consistent use of the algorithm. So just real quick to cover the algorithm, again, this is the first part. You take the family's priority, you identify, you start with their concern, you identify the routines that are affected, and then you write like this. So essentially it's kind of a fill in the blank. You'll write the child, whatever the child's name, will participate in whatever the routine is. You finish writing the outcome by with a statement by doing what, and then you'll wrap it up with so that or in order to. In some instances, the statement by participating in would be sufficient to describe what will be better. So here's an example of what that looks like, and the underlined parts are the fill in the blank bits. So Marco will participate in meal times by feeding himself with a spoon so that he does not have to be fed. So essentially, these little bits here where you fill in the blank are the pieces that you would fill in based upon the family's priority that was identified. I'm going to move on to show you some examples. Again, I do want to highlight that there are examples that are in the IFSP process guidance handbook. Some of these are taken from that. What you see, and that I cannot reinforce enough, is you've got to start with the family's desire. You've got to start with what their priority is, and it's got to be written in a way that is clearly understood so that you can write the IFSP outcomes. So you start with, so here are some examples of the family's desire, their concern. On the IFSP, also there's a section of what's happening now, and then we can convert that into the Ifsp outcome. And these examples that are included here all use the algorithm. So just to walk through one quickly, the family's concern in this particular case was for Jamie to use words to communicate, and the times that it came up with this family was when he's hungry, when he wants TV, when he wants a toy, and when he wants outside. You get a sense of what is happening now. He's pointing and he's grunting to let others know what it is that he wants. He's also getting frustrated when he's not understood. So using the algorithm, what's written is Jamie will participate in, and here are the routine times of the day that it came up. And here's the by, and we want him to use words to tell family members what he wants. And here's the so that he can learn to talk and be understood. So with each one of these examples, you'll see how the algorithm is used. It starts off with the child will participate in, and then it's got the routine, and then there's the by doing what. That's the behavior, what it is that we want to see happen. And then there is a so that or in order to if needed. I'm just going to pause here for a moment to see if there are any questions or if anybody else has comments or experience in using the algorithm that they might like to share. Okay, I'm going to move on. I think there's a couple of comments. The algorithm does save time. Absolutely, it does save time. It certainly can save time. Which isn't that something we're all looking for, is ways to save time. Thank you. Moving on, to reinforce the point, it has to be understandable to all. Here what we've got is a little cartoon that says, today's lesson, nonverbal communication skills with emphasis on formal symbolic termination of ongoing personal relationships by means of gestural semantic norms. And then you'll see the other person there translating that to real language, what it really means. It means they're learning to wave bye-bye. I think this little cartoon, again, is certainly an exaggeration, a reminder to us that less is more and simple is better. It doesn't need to be more complex than it needs to be. We do want to make sure that our IFSP outcomes are written in a way that they are understandable to all, and one way is using the algorithm to help to keep it simple. Let's move on to another poll question. Consider these outcomes, and your task is to identify which are functional, quality, child-level IFSP outcomes. Again, I do want to reinforce that the criteria are not included in these. Okay, excellent. You are absolutely correct. It is, in fact, A, C, and D. The C example here doesn't exactly use the algorithm, but it does have all the components. It does tell us what it is that we want to see happen. We want him to use words to tell his mom what he wants. It does include the context at mealtimes and what it is that's going to be better. So it does include all of those components. You just have to look a little bit for them. Whereas in the ones that are written with the algorithm, perhaps it was a little bit easier to get to those straight away. All right. I'd like now to move on to another type of outcome that we talked about. Remember, we talked about two different kinds of outcomes, child level and family level. The family level outcomes, just like child outcomes, family outcomes must state an endpoint and they must be observable. Again, these still are going to have to be measurable. Family outcomes, however, do not follow the child outcome algorithm that we just reviewed. At this point in time, there is not a set algorithm for family level outcomes. Rather, they are quite varied. But we're going to take a look at some examples. So here on the screen, what you see is another little excerpt from the rubric. This is specific to family level IFSP outcomes. And what we're looking for here is, again, you're going to see in that first column, unacceptable. We don't want family level outcomes to be vague or too broad. We don't want them to include undefined jargon. And we don't want outcomes that are not linked to family concerns. What we do want is that family-friendly language, easy to understand, linked to family desires, linked to what it is that we want to see, what they want to see happen, what they stated as their priorities, and it's going to answer the question what the family would like to see happen. They're also going to be specific, and they're not going to be compound. So let me give you an example of a compound outcome. Might be for the family to find daycare for Carlos and to get his older brother into a preschool program. So you see that that's a compound. So one of them is to find daycare for Carlos, and another part of that outcome was to get the older brother into a preschool program. So we do want to make sure that the outcomes, even with family level outcomes, that they are singular and that they are specific. I'm going to move on here and share with you some examples. Again, I'll reinforce that these are in your handbook, and there are other examples that are out there as well. Again, you start with the family's desire, what their priority is, what's happening now, and then we write that into a family level outcome. In the last column here, you'll see the family level IFSP outcomes. You'll see that they, in some ways, they're a little bit simpler. We want to make sure that they're clear, that they're derived from the family concern, and they're stated in a way that's understandable. So here's an example. This first one is that the family wanted to learn more about autism and tell family about their son, Camden. What's happening now is he just got the diagnosis of CDD, and the outcome is written, parents will have enough information about autism to comfortably explain Camden's condition to family and friends. So we do want to make sure that the outcomes are written in a way that they are specific, that they're not compound. Here are some other examples that are included as well. Let's move on to a poll question, since you guys are doing so brilliantly at these today. Here, considering quality family level IFSP outcomes, identify from the list here which of the following would you consider quality family level IFSP outcomes? Again, I will reinforce that in these examples, the criteria are not included. On these, some of them have just a little bit more information about what the family's concern is. That's included in the friends here. Okay, excellent. It is A, B, and D. Absolutely. I think some of you might have paused a little bit with the second one, B, and is this a complex outcome because it's two different locations? And with this particular one, it was being able to get out of the house and being out in places where there's a little bit more auxiliary noise and such. You'll notice here that the issue was Maddie, Henry's mom, had a hearing impairment. Let's move on to measurable criteria now. Here's a little funny. There's two little girls here standing, looking at the scale saying, don't step on it, it makes you cry. We do want to make sure that our outcomes are measurable. We've talked about family level outcomes and child level outcomes. Now we're going to look specifically at the measurable criteria. It is critically important that our outcomes, both child level and family level, are measurable. It is the means to know if the outcome is achieved, and it is certainly going to be helpful to ensure that the team members are working towards the same end regarding IFSP outcomes. Criteria statements are really the descriptors of what constitutes achievement of the outcome, and they're going to serve as that tool for team members to use to evaluate progress towards achievement of the outcome. So the criteria is what will achievement of the outcome look like, and as we measure achievement of the outcome, we'll be looking at how close we are to that. Included here is an excerpt from the rubric. Again, it follows the same pattern that we looked at before. In the first column here are things that are unacceptable. So a criterion that is vague or not understandable. If it's a direct repeat of the outcome, then it's really not criteria. If it's not functional or not measurable, those are things that we do not want to see. Rather, when we think about child level outcomes and the criteria, we want to make sure that all of the criterion are functional, that they are a measurement of achievement of the outcome, and we want to be able to see that they're answering these questions. Can you actually see it? When, where, with whom, and how often are the things that we want to see included. At the best practice level, again, it's all items from column 2 here. You also want to make sure that the criterion is obviously linked to the outcome, but is not a direct repeat of the outcome. And then we've got the questions that are included here as well. All right. Here is the remainder of the algorithm that we looked at earlier. It starts here with point 5. You're going to add a criterion for demonstration. You're going to, as needed, add additional criterion for generalization and maintenance, and then identify over what period of time. So let's take a look at the example that was included from the outcome. We had Marco will participate in mealtimes by feeding himself with a spoon independently so that he does not have to be fed. Adding the criteria is, we'll know this is achieved when Marco uses the spoon to eat a serving of spoon foods at 2 meals per day for 5 consecutive days. And then, of course, we're going to talk a little bit more here in just a minute about the timelines for achievement. So what we do want to make sure when we're talking about the criteria is that we think about generalization, that we think about over what period of time, because a child just being able to do something once does not necessarily mean that he's mastered it. So by thinking about over what duration, so here in this particular example, when he's able to do this at 2 meals per day for 5 consecutive days. Again, it's something that's relatively easy for families to measure. It's built into the context of their routines. Certainly what we do want to make sure of is that the criteria, just like the outcomes, are written with to address the family's priorities as identified through the routine-based interview. Suzanne, did you have anything that you wanted to add or comment further on with regards to the algorithm and the criteria component of it?
I guess kind of the same thing. We were trying to put criteria up in the actual outcome instead of putting it in the criteria. And I think after we kind of worked through that process, we were able to figure out that when we were out during the RBI, we would get more information and ask the family, like, what do you consider being progress? How do you think this is going to be met? What does that look like to you? Because sometimes their expectations were much different than ours. And so it was good for us to say, you know, how many times a day are you trying to do this now? You know, what's going to be achievable for you all? Because, you know, we might set things at a higher standard, or the family may have a really low expectation where it could be met within a week, and so we really want to attain for what's developmentally appropriate. So it gave us some opportunities to shape the criteria a little bit more, as well as for us to all get on the same page to figure out what we actually wanted to see happen with the criteria. And again, with having to use so much specific language there, it kind of helps us to make sure that we're addressing the outcome and that we're all also looking towards what truly is met for the criteria. There's no ambiguity of ambiguity of actually what we're working on. So it's not that we're just going to increase the amount he uses a spoon, but actually we're going to know when he does exactly what the criteria says, and then we know it's met, and then we can move on, or we can decide to do something else with that outcome. But again, it kind of keeps it very concrete for the family and for the provider to be on the same page.
Thanks, Suzanne.
You're welcome.
Any other folks have some comments on the continuation of this, the remaining part of this algorithm? All right, I'm going to move on then. What you've got here, again, are some more examples. This is from the earlier slide where we talked about the IFSP outcomes. So here is the IFSP outcome before. This was regarding Jamie participating in meal times, play times, and outside times, and family together times by using words to tell family members what he wants. And the criteria is written here. When Jamie uses 5 single words with family members to request something each day for 5 consecutive days. So we've got exactly what we want to see him doing, is we want him to see him using single words, and then we know that it's going to be to request something each day, and it might be each day during one of these routines for 5 consecutive days. What you really want to think about when you're writing the criteria is you've got to know where the child is at, and it's got to be something that's realistic. So if Jamie were a little bit further along with his communication skills and ability to let us know what it is that he wants, this might have looked a little bit higher level. Again, what we know is that when we're looking at mastery, it might have to happen a few different times over a period over a duration of time. Something else that can be helpful in writing the criteria, again, we want to make sure the families are part of criteria development, and sometimes we might begin writing the criteria and then leave blanks for the family to fill in. So, for example, we might have started to draft criteria. In the first one, we might have said, when Jamie uses blank, words with family members to request something, blank for, and then how long. So we can begin to kind of put a bit of a skeleton criteria together and review it with the family if we don't have a good sense of knowing exactly what that criteria might be. Again, the bottom line is we want to make sure that the criteria are understandable to everybody and that they're doable and that they truly are a measure of achievement of the outcome. Let's move on to a poll question now. This is specific to criteria. Which of the following are quality criteria for the following child outcomes? What you've got here is 2 child outcomes. The first is Patty will participate in meal times and play times by using words. to say what she wants rather than fussing so her parents can understand her. And the second one is regarding Thad, and Thad will participate in outdoor playtimes by walking across the lawn without falling so he doesn't hurt himself. And you're going to choose, oh, it's set up a little bit different. Assume that this is A and B and C and D.
And Naomi, I was going to ask you that because I noticed that in a past slide, so I'll fix that.
Yeah, sorry. But you guys already figured that out. Excellent, excellent. I see all of the responses coming in, and you're absolutely correct. This would be the more appropriate criteria. The B response here and A here. So when Thad is independently walks across the lawn, and here they wanted to specify from the door to the swing set 3 times a week for 2 consecutive weeks. Again, when you're writing criteria, you want to think about, in this particular case, you wrote it as 3 times per week. We want to think about how many opportunities there are in a week. That'll help guide you with your criteria development as well. Okay, we're going to move on to take a peek at family outcome criteria. So let's take a look here now. Again, as I mentioned, these are a little bit simpler. Included here is a little excerpt from my IFSP rubric, and this is on the family outcome component of the rubric. You'll see here the quality indicators. These are the things that we don't want to see. And then here are the things that we do want to see. We do want to see that the criteria together is a measurement of achievement towards the outcome. We're going to talk about the achievement of it. It might be by time frame. It might be by date. In some cases, it might be by family satisfaction. That might be our measure of achievement. If the outcome is achieved when family has the information to their satisfaction, for example. But you do want to be able to see it, to have it be observed, or to have it be able to be reported. Again, you want to see that it's obviously linked to the outcome and not a direct repeat of the outcome. And then we've got our questions that are here. You ready for a poll question? Okay, here it is. This is regarding family level outcomes and criteria. So you've got 2 family level outcomes here. Parents want to find a reliable daycare for Amy that Amanda can use periodically during Glenn's upcoming deployment. You choose here of A or B, which is a quality criteria. The second one is Sylvia wants to find new play activities that she can use to engage Jeremy on rainy days when they can't go outside. And your options here, apologize for this, it will be C and D. So just read these as C and D. Okay, absolutely. Your responses are A, which is correct. And assuming this was a C, C is correct. One of the things that we have to be a little bit cautious of is making sure that our criteria matches our outcome. So sometimes we have a family level outcome, and it can be written as, we want to be careful not to write it as a child level criteria. So for example, this first one, the family wants to find a reliable daycare that she can use. The outcome is for the parents to find the reliable daycare. So this is the correct criteria in this particular example, when the family has chosen the daycare they're comfortable with, versus this example of criteria, although it's not complete, gets more at what Amy, the child, will be doing. So if we've got a family level outcome, we need to have a family level criteria. So if the family, for example, here's another one, if the family outcome is something about them wanting to have some information about toilet training readiness, to get a better idea of when Amanda might be ready for toilet training, the criteria, if the criteria were when Amanda can sit on the potty regularly, that's a bit of a mix, because the outcome was family level and that example of partial criteria is more child level. So make sure if it's a family level outcome that the criteria matches and is at a family level as well. That can sometimes be a stickler. but I think just by reviewing it over, you'll be able to pick those pieces up. Okay, I'm going to move on to a couple of other required parts of the IFSP. This is the inclusion of procedures. These are really the means by which progress is measured. The procedures must also match the outcome and criteria and identify who's going to do what. Often, this is going to be parent reports. It may be a parent-completed checklist or other type of data tool, provided the family it's something that they're interested in. It may be parent report and provider observation. And as we talked, just as each outcome is individualized and specific, so too should the procedures be. So for example, if the outcome was for Carlos to sleep through the night in his bed, it's unlikely that the procedure for measuring progress would include provider observation, because the provider is likely not going to be there to see if Carlos is actually sleeping through the night in his bed. So we want to be cautious that our procedures fit also the outcome and the criteria. Everything has to be linked together. Another required component on the IFSP, and you'll see it here on the form, is that the timeline for reviewing outcomes progress must be stated. You all know the IFSP must be reviewed at 6 months. However, it is possible to review the timeline sooner for some outcomes or in some particular circumstances. So let's say, for example, an outcome was for the family to find ways to get Gordon to stop banging his head when he gets upset. So we're going to be looking at gathering some information towards some strategies of how to help Gordon to stop banging his head by replacing it with something more appropriate. It might be that we don't want to wait 6 months to review that outcome. We might want to set that one or any other one that the family has a little bit sooner. So the timeline has to be reviewed within 6 months, but in some cases it might actually be sooner than that. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next poll question, and this is regarding procedures and timelines. Here what you have is an outcome. Tara will participate in bedtime by sleeping in her bed through the night so that everyone can get a good night's sleep. And here you've got the criteria included as well. We'll know this is met when Tara sleeps in her bed throughout the night for 7 consecutive nights. Your task here, this one is actually done right, identify the procedure, your choices are A or B, and identify the timeline, your choices are C or D. What do you think would be the best pick given the choices that are included here on the screen? Okay, absolutely. It would be parent report. Again, like we talked about with the earlier example, it's hard to have provider observations when it's something about sleeping through the night. The timeline here, 6 months could certainly be appropriate. It'd be difficult to say, let's review it in 7 days. We might certainly informally review it in 7 days, but I think we're probably going to need more than 7 days from the start of the IFSP to review that particular outcome. When we're talking about the timelines for reviewing here, we're looking at the more formal kind of review. Certainly, this is when we're going to review the progress formally versus the informal review that happens as part of each visit we have with the family. So here on this particular one, as you said, it would be a parent report. 6 months would probably be the best there. Okay, I want to move on, and I've got a couple of colleagues that are going to join me on the discussion about IFSP strategies. This is a bit that's a little bit different. This has been an element that's traditionally been included on IFSPs. I will take a moment here just to say specifically, IDEA requires that IFSPs include a statement of measurable results or outcomes expected to be achieved for the infant or toddler and family. In IDEA legislation, you'll also see reference to including pre-literacy and language skills. as developmentally appropriate. So certainly we need to have outcomes included. We've got that. We need to have criteria, procedures, and timelines. We've got that used to determine the degree to which progress is being achieved, and in order to decide what kinds of modifications. IDEA does not specifically state that strategies have to be included. I will encourage you to look to the current IDEA statutes if you want to look a little bit closer. A good URL to review the statute is, and I'm going to type it here in the chat, it's www.idea, A is one, ed.gov. www.ideaed.gov is a good, reliable source to look at IDEA statute. There's also a couple of training PowerPoints that are included up there, and it's a pretty easy, searchable resource as well. So one I would encourage you to take a look at. So in IDEA with the IFSP, the inclusion of strategies is not required. I do want to reinforce, though, that this does not in any manner, shape, or form mean that they are not important. They are absolutely important. It is the means of how it is that we're going to work with the family to achieve those particular outcomes that they have set as their priorities. So with the EDIS Tri-Service IFSP, strategies are not included in the IFSP, but rather they're documented in ongoing service notes. So I'm going to just back up real quick to, let me see if I can do this. Oh, is it there? So here is a picture of the IFSP outcome. Again, this is the top half of the page. The second half of the page looks exactly the same. You've got the outcome here, the criteria, the procedures, and the timeline. So the specific strategies are not stated here in the IFSP. However, as I mentioned, strategies are still critically important, and they are documented in the ongoing service notes. So the reason for this change is that strategies are ever changing. They're being added to, they're being revised, they're being tweaked. Families are coming up with great ideas. Through consultation and collaboration, teams are coming up with great ideas. It's known that it's impossible to know all of the strategies, or in some cases, even the best starting point with strategies when the IFSP is being written. It is, however, key that they are documented in ongoing service provision notes. So what happened a while back is there was a bit of a pilot to take a look at this, to see, is this doable? And what I'd like to do, there's a couple of colleagues of mine that were involved with some of that early pilot work, to speak a little bit about the change with looking at IFSP strategies or outcome strategies, not listed specifically on the IFSP, but being documented in the ongoing intervention notes. Alyn McGrath from, actually she was in Heidelberg, now she's in Launchville. Alyn, are you on the line? You'll have to star
2.
6 to unmute your phone.
Star 2.
Star 2, sorry. I saw that she was here in the on the webinar. Alyn, are you there? Okay, maybe while she's figuring out how to star 2 to unmute, another colleague that was involved with the pilot, Sylvia Rich, are you on the line?
Are you there?
Yes.
Okay, because it said it was unmuted, and I just didn't know if I was still on.
Oh, great. Okay, so Sylvia, please share with us a bit about your experience and your team's experience with this change with strategies.
Okay, well, I think for us, one of the dreaded parts of the IFSP was always coming up with strategies, and it's exactly as you said. You kind of have the outcome, you kind of have an idea of how you want to get it, and then you're expected to go ahead and figure out how are you going to achieve this outcome. For new IFSPs, you don't know the family very well. You don't even know the child very well. And so it became kind of cookie cutter. We would just kind of put the same old things on all the time. Second to that, we found that when we were writing notes, we typically ended up putting those kinds of things in notes. Here's what we did. Here's how the child was doing. Here's what we tried. So for us, it felt like, gosh, we're being redundant. So if we could just have the strategies in the note, because we're kind of doing it maybe not in the proper format initially, but it's kind of happening there. Strategies are something that change, I think, weekly. And, you try one thing, it may work great, it may not work. So you have something on a 6-month plan that, is going to be sitting there that you know within the first 2 weeks it's not going to be something that works. We found, too, that strategies were kind of global and broad when we put them on the IFSP, and now it's more detailed as far as what kinds of things we're trying with the family. I think that what it does, it brings those outcomes to the forefront each and every visit, and it puts families in that whole discussion mode where they know what's happening. And so, did you try this last week? Yeah, that worked. It didn't work. And they're with us when we sit there and try to modify what we're doing, come back and say that worked or that didn't work. When you talked about the timeline and how often you're going to review a strategy, an outcome, it's kind of interesting because I feel that we are reviewing outcomes pretty consistently. You may not get to all outcomes every week, but you basically are reviewing them on a very, very regular basis. Does that help?
Yes. I'm curious if anybody else has questions about how strategies are documented now. And let me also check back with Alin here. I see some chat in the chat box. Alin, are you on the line now to add to our discussion about strategies?
Hi, Naomi, it's me. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes. Okay, excellent. This is, okay, Alin, maybe if you speak up just a little bit, I think we'll be better able to hear you.
Okay, I'm leaning over the table with Sue and Selena and Elizabeth here to help me out. I was really happy to be a part of the pilot program in Heidelberg to shorten the IFSP.
Excuse me, Lynn. I'm going to have to ask you if you could speak up a little bit. I'm getting some feedback in the chat that we're not able to hear you.
Can you hear me on this?
Much better.
Oh, okay. All right. That helps. I'm not bending over a table now, so standing upright. Anyway, I was happy to be working on the pilot project with Terry Giglio and Julie Brannon and Carol Shrimp. It's not often that you get asked to work on a project where you get to decrease the amount of work that you're doing, and that's what's really nice about this new IFSP-PD. When we're writing up the outcomes, we can just think about the outcomes, think about the criteria, and go on with it. The strategies are really viewed as something that is discussed with the family, so it gives you a great jumping off point with the family, especially for those first visits. And I think the bottom line for me is that when we're talking about the strategies with the families in their home, talking about what the outcome is they want to talk at mealtimes, we really get down and dirty with the families and start figuring out, okay, what does this mean and what can we do? How can we make this work? I know it's good to have some strategies sort of in the back of your head that you can review with families, but there's nothing more real than when you talk with a family and you come up with that strategy together. That, for me, is when families, when the strategy resonates and you know that the family is going to carry over with that strategy. So that's what I have to say.
Excellent, and thank you both very, very much for sharing your experience. I know that you both have had the opportunity to try writing IFSPs this way, where and I've I recall we always talked about it's not that we're getting rid of strategies. Strategies in no manner, shape, or form are being gotten rid of, but rather the way that they're being documented is a little bit different. And I think the results of the pilot, and certainly feedback from everybody that was involved with it, including families, is that it does certainly make sense. Let me move on now just to share with you quickly a little bit about what the documentation of strategies might look like. We've revised some of how notes are written to ensure that strategies are included in the notes. This is an example look at a method for documenting progress notes to make certain that strategies are included. These are called SIP notes. They include the status, the intervention, and the plan. In the status part, and this would be written for each outcome. So let's say outcome number 1, you would indicate what the status, what the intervention of the plan. Outcome 2, you would do the same thing. The status is really a statement of status of progress towards the outcome. And we like to include something like making progress, not making progress, slow progress, that type of thing, and then a brief description. The intervention is what was the intervention, what was done. It might be newly planned intervention strategy, like Lynn had talked about. There is really figuring out together with the family and what's that intervention strategy going to be. In some cases, it might be a review of prior plans, implemented strategies. Some cases, it might be something that was prior planned and the family just didn't have time to do it. What we want to think about here with the intervention is what was the strategy, what was the explicit strategy that we tried, and think also about what was the intervention interaction between the caregiver or the parent and the provider. And then the plan is briefly to identify who's going to do what with regards to the outcome. And if we think about the plan, is in many ways, this is what is it the family wants to do between now and the next visit. So that plan is who's going to do what, and also to think about framing it from the perspective of the family. Let me give you one example. I know that in this little webinar that we're doing, we really don't have time to get into great detail. I'm looking at the clock as well. But just to give you some beginning ideas about SIP notes and what they look like, and hopefully we'll have time to discuss this a little bit more in the future. Here is an example. Here is the outcome, and this is the outcome that Grady is going to participate in book reading by looking at books with his parents and staying with the activity. In the SNP note, sometimes the outcome might be condensed just a little bit. So, for example, this one doesn't include the criteria. It doesn't include what's going to be better. So sometimes it's helpful just to have a bit more of a condensed version written in the notes. The status here is the status of progress towards the outcome. So in this particular example, the status is that parents found a book that he seems to like about train. So he's making some progress towards looking at books. The parents have recently found a book that he likes. And then you'll see here the intervention, and the intervention here gets a bit at what the interventionist did in terms of kind of the coaching approach. So the interventionist observed Mrs. D and Grady read the book, commented that Grady seems to like it when Mrs. D lets him hold the book. So a bit of an indirect teaching opportunity there as she observed what was happening between the parent and Grady. This seems to work better than holding it for him. And then it goes on and talks a little bit about, they also talked about reading the pictures. So here, specifically, the strategies included the strategy being reading the pictures of the book rather than the words, and that there was an opportunity for Mrs. D to practice that with feedback, and she got a bit more comfortable with it. And then the plan here is what Mrs. D plans to do. She plans to continue reading the train book, focusing a bit more on talking about pictures. So these are the key elements that are included in SIP notes. Again, this is really just to kind of give you a little bit of a taste. At this point in time, I would like to turn it over to another colleague. Christine Ashman was going to talk a little bit about SIP notes. Chris, are you on the line? You'll have to star.
I did. Am I on?
Okay. Oh, yeah. Oh, great.
Okay. All right. I did start too. We moved from SOAP notes, which was an expectation of the hospital, to SIP notes, which really allows us to be more specific, be sure that we address each outcome that was discussed, not necessarily every single outcome. And we can do that because we have standard notes with SNPMS, so we have a template that we can fill in, which allows us to do things more quickly than possibly otherwise. I think it helps focus. It helps focus the note, and it helps us assure that we get the most important things in. My concern often is that if I do 50-minute visit and take 30 minutes to write a note, that's really not good use of my time. So I'm really interested in a format that allows us to get the information in and do it quickly enough that we're doing efficient notes. And I think this format allows us to do that.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris, and thank you for the additional commentary on the time. You're absolutely right. We certainly don't want note writing to take longer than the actual visit. And I think what you see here in this little example, and there's other examples available as well, it's not extensive amount of writing, but yet it does get at the explicit strategies and the intervention interactions between the caregiver and the provider. Let me just open it up real quick to any other comments with regards to experience or such with this SIP note format and ensuring that the documentation of strategies is included in the intervention note. I think you'll see from this example that the intervention notes are not just a reiteration of everything that happened on the visit, but really tailored to focus at looking at what is the intervention, what is the strategy, and what is the plan to move forward. A question about RS. Yes, in fact, some folks are using SIP notes for RS as well. All right, I'm cognizant of the time, so I'm going to move on. This next section, just to illustrate here for you, the IFSP review, there are 5 boxes at the bottom for IFSPs to be reviewed. They do have to be reviewed. Each outcome does have to be reviewed formally at 6 months as part of that review. Periodic reviews may happen during the course of the IFSP, and new, of course, or modified outcomes might be added. If it's a modified outcome, really what we're talking about is writing a new outcome. We're going to talk a little bit more specifically next time about the change in review process. But I did want to highlight here that at the bottom of each outcome there is space for certainly the formal review and periodic informal review. So let's say we're moving along and we've decided that with this particular outcome, they've met the outcome, so we're going to discontinue it and we can write the date in there. Just a way to document those periodic reviews that are happening. And we'll talk a little bit more about this next time as well. Okay, I would like to open it up now for any further questions or discussions, recognizing we don't have a whole lot of time. I certainly will stay on the line for a while, so I certainly encourage you to use the chat feature. Jane, I wonder also if you could put up that feedback poll so that folks have a chance to respond to that for folks that have things that they have to get to straight away.
Yes, and let me change the poll here we will use and open that up. Very good.
A question about, I think, Michelle, I think this is what you're asking, correct me if I'm wrong, In SNPMS, what ends up happening is you have a template for your notes, and you'll write, a brief version of each outcome, and then underneath each outcome, you'll have SIP. In some cases, what happens is, let's say there are 6 outcomes on a particular plan, and you only get to 2 outcomes, and that's totally fine on a visit. So you'll say, for whichever outcomes you weren't able to address, you would write, not addressed on this date.
Okay, well, thanks.
All right, so please, I encourage everybody to take a minute to respond to the poll question that is up there now just about the usefulness of today's visit, about our webinar. All right. I see a comment here, it takes a long time, and I'm sorry, I'm not sure that I'm following the line of what it is that's taking a long time. Christy, I don't know if you can add a little bit more to that comment. And while you are using the outcome then SIP for each, the way to save time is to have a template in SNPMS. So for each, so that you're not having to rewrite it every single time. So when you pull up the note for a kiddo, you've got a set draft note that's already in there, and then you just add to that. So you're not having to retype the outcome. You're absolutely right. If you had to retype the outcome each time, that would be a little bit tedious. So rather to set up a template, and then under each one, you just go through and identify the outcomes that you worked on with the family on that particular day and enter the SIP component. Hopefully that makes sense. So again, I encourage everybody to, if you've got additional comments or questions, please do use the chat. We are going to be reviewing that and having a follow-on webinar to address those. I also want to reinforce to you here on the screen is a reminder of our next webinar. This will be the 7th webinar. We're going to be talking about finishing up the IFSP. We're going to be talking about service decisions and the IFSP agreement page, and specifically covering pages 67 through 88 of the IFSP process guidance handbook. So at 4:30, let me thank everybody again for your participation. We certainly do appreciate that, and want to again invite everybody to share their comments and questions. If there are questions with regards to the content, please do not hesitate to send me an email. My email is included on the screen here now. If there are questions with regards to the webinar system, access to the webinar or that type of thing, please use the MOS Webinars website that's included here on the screen. So with that, let me thank everybody again for your participation. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to use the chat. And Jane, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Naomi, thank you so much. That's actually all that we would have for today. I will leave the website open for a few moments if you've not yet had a chance to complete that survey in the lower left-hand side. If you can just take a moment and click on your response there. As well as if you'd like to go ahead and download any of the files that are in the upper right-hand corner in the file share. All 6 sessions slide decks are up there along with the handbook and all of the supplemental materials that we've been using. And then just to remind folks, if anyone had not yet done that, if you've got, if you've not yet done so, if there are more than one of you at your site location with your login, please enter all of those names into the chat box of everyone participating with you so we can be sure to give everyone credit for having attended. We would greatly appreciate it. Want to make sure we give everybody, like I said, we want to make sure we give everyone credit. So thank you so much, everybody. Assuming there is no other questions verbally. Okay, then we can go ahead and end the teleconference portion of the event, and have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you in a few weeks. And we will be online if anyone has a question that they'd like to submit through the chat box. So have a great afternoon, everybody. See you soon. Bye-bye.